back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. Mixing and mingling the two here. Former County Executive Don Moeller joining us from his estate in Catonsville while we're all on pandemic lockdown. We want to give a shout out from Catonsville to downtown, our friends at State Fair. And, of course, Evan's over there with the shrimp and grits, chicken and waffles, chicken wings, the sandwiches, and the send home packages. If you want to cook your food at home, he can hook that up for you, as well as opening a Mexican restaurant across Frederick Road. We're looking forward to summer over in the Ville. Downtown Fadley's has crab cakes curbside, and you can ship them anywhere. You want to be a hero to someone out of state during a pandemic? Ship them some Fadley's. Go to Fadley's online and do that. Also, Moeller and Gary Realty. Don, I'll let you talk about your boy Jeff Moeller, who I think you even learned some things out in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault when you heard Jeff interviewed by me, right?
Well, I'm amazed. Jeff, along with so many other realtors, just they continue to be able to list homes, sell homes, do settlements. I know Jeff works closely with our good friend David Thurston at Crown Title. I know David threw some picnic tables out in the parking lot so they can do settlements out there. It's just amazing to me. Again, we're going to talk a lot with our next guest about technology. But Jeff Moeller and Gary Realty talks about the importance of technology. They're taking folks on virtual tours. He's talked about folks fixing up their homes. I'm sure our guest is like the rest of us. There's a lot of honey-do list getting done during this pandemic. And Jeff said, while you're fixing up your home, really not a better time to think about moving if you're thinking about selling. So give Jeff a call, 410-746-1547. All our good friends at KO Public Affairs, Damien O'Doherty, Steve Carney, Rick Abruzzi, the whole gang down there that really helps us here at Baltimore Positive and connects us with people making a difference. And Nestor, speaking of people making a difference, our next guest, really one of the most visible, now 15 years later, Scott, one of the most visible elected officials in Baltimore County is its state's attorney. I've been state's attorney since 2006, and it's a pleasure to welcome Baltimore County State's Attorney Scott Shellenberger. Scott, welcome.
Don, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, I tell you what, it's full circle for you, man, because up the hill on Hart Road at WNST, where our towers are right next to the 101.9 towers, we literally hear the whistles and the play out on the fields at Loch Raven High School. So, I know it is full circle, and you and I both share the UB alum, on the wall as well. So I don't know that we've ever been in a room together, or I remember when you began and you were running, and now there's a full track record of a lot of different things to talk about, including your relationship with Don as well in running the county. Don, for you in state's attorneys, and we've had Brian Frosch on earlier, and I encourage everybody to go out to Baltimore Positive and check that out. When you're running the county for the 7-8 months that you were there, tell me what a county executive needs from a Scott Shellenberger and how government works together in this way.
That is a great question, Nestor. I will address that. We'll get into all that. You actually lead me to where I was going to say to Scott. Scott, it's remarkable when I get ready for this interview today, and it says Scott Shellenberger's been state's attorney since 2006, and immediately my brain flies back to late 2004, early 2005, when a small group of us sat in your office and said, "Hey, bud, we think you'd be a great state's attorney." I mean, does that seem like yesterday to you?
In some ways it seems like yesterday, but in some ways it seems like a pretty long time ago. I remember that meeting also, which was, originally organized by the great county executive, Jim Smith. And he was a wonderful supporter. I would have probably not won that first election and then all the other ones if it hadn't been for the support that I got from him and his team, which obviously included you at the time, Don. It's just remarkable that it seems like yesterday, but we have come a long way in this office, in this county, since that meeting.
Were you a guy that aspired to this?
Hold on 1 second, because Scott's answer gets to your question, Nestor. And people, and not only might say, but people did say, and Scott, you'll remember this, people did say to County Executive Smith at the time, why do you care who the next state's attorney is? Why are you going to put your political capital in this race? Why do you think it's important to have a high-quality state's attorney? Now, sir, that gets to your question about the relationship with the state's attorney, both for the county executives I work for and then Scott's invaluable help to me during my 7 months in office. And I just up front want to say to Scott, thank you for your service. And Scott, maybe I'll turn it on you. Talk about, from your perspective, the relationship that a state's attorney has, not only with the county executive, but with other elected officials and the county council. How do you see the role?
Well, number one, the most important thing to the citizens of any jurisdiction, but particularly Baltimore County, is public safety. They always care about public safety a great deal. And so, my folks are the ones that put the bad guys in jail. And we try to keep the public safe. In addition to that, we have to have a very close and good working relationship with our police department. And of course, the police department comes under the leadership of the county executive. So that kind of triangle of county executive, who, by the way, supplies my budget, along with the county.
Those discussions, didn't we, Scott?
You took good care of me. So
he didn't tell you talk to Johnny about that.
No, I'm sorry. No, Johnny and I are fine. I met with him, and he was very he would listen very hard about some of the issues that I was bringing up in our budget this year. But that triangle between the police department, the county executive, and the state's attorney is really an important one that has to be functioning and working very well. The police do the arrests. My people put them in jail, and the county executive supplies the budget for both and oversees all of that. So those relationships are very important.
Man, you ask people in government stuff, you learn stuff, right, Don? I mean, this is what we put Baltimore Positive together for, because that is a great explanation of all of that. But for me, you went to law school, you come out, you've told me now this story of you sitting with Jim Smith, but making that decision to go toward the life you've chosen, the public life, and running for office, and putting up signs and seeing your name and being a public figure, was there ever a point that you didn't want to do this, or was this always sort of your path? That did you see this at the University of Baltimore 30 years ago for yourself?
I actually did. So I was very lucky when I was at the end of my first year of law school. I got a job here in the state's attorney's office. At the age of 22, I just finished my first year of law school. I got a law clerk job. Sandy O'Connor, who was a great state's attorney from Catonsville, hired me. And as early as 1982, the bug of this office bit me. I knew I wanted to be a trial attorney. I knew I wanted to eventually lead this office. I even made statements about that very early on when I was a lawyer to some very good friends, and people always felt like it was a pipe dream, but it was a dream that actually came true. So after I finished my 3.5 years of law school, the next day, Sandy had me in district court as an assistant state's attorney prosecuting cases, and I spent the next 8 years moving up through the office, through the various divisions, and eventually at the age of 31, became head of the sex offense unit. Unfortunately, I did, have a family and 2 children who were getting older, and so I had to leave. I had to leave and go make some money. But again, another great relationship developed out of that. I got a job with the law offices of Peter Angelos, and Mr. Angelos gave me the opportunity to try civil cases in a number of states. And I learned so much not being here. Learning from the outside, I think, was a really important facet. And then, of course, I had a terrific relationship with Jim Smith. I had tried several high-profile murder cases in front of him when I was a prosecutor. And when I reached out to him and said, hey, Sandy's retiring, this is my dream, this is something I've always wanted to do, we all got together in that room and we figured out how we were going to do it.
Well, does it begin with you hating criminals? I mean, and hating the criminal life? I mean, I would think to do what you do. I sit here in disgust on a nightly basis at some of the stuff my wife puts on the television. But in these stories, when you talk about child abuse, sexual assault, we had Brian Frosh on, and I said, I can't imagine what I would want done to the criminal that holds a gun to my wife's head at a red light to steal our car. You know what I mean? Like, I think about these things that happen, these felons and gangs and all of the things that you are there to protect us. And I live in the city, but my business is in the county, as you well know, right up the road from your alma mater at Loch Raven. But I would think that as a society, we're all appalled by crime, but there are people preying on people every day. And at the end, there's you and the county executive and the jail cell, literally, that stands in the way for all of us who've been violated, right?
Well, while of course we focus on the defendants, my motivation is all about the victims. Right. That's the place where my folks are always thinking and working and caring about. And so, I find it kind of ironic that when people ask me about cases that I prosecuted, I always remember the defendant's name. And it's because we call the case State of Maryland versus defendant. And yet there will be times where I'll remember vividly everything about the defendant, about the trial, about what happened, and then somebody asks me who the victim is and I can't remember. Ugh. And it's even though that's our motivation, because we're always in court referring to State of Maryland versus defendant, those are the people that we remember. But I don't have any ill motive towards them. My folks just want to go downstairs and professionally do their job and represent the victims and make sure that if this is a dangerous criminal, there's not another victim next year or the year after that, or sometimes 30 years after that.
And Scott, boy, that was so well stated. Again, if you're in the car and you're just turning us on, you're listening to Baltimore County State's Attorney Scott Shellenberger, been in the job since 2006. A couple of things in Scott's answer there, and Scott, maybe you can expand upon it. Is Nestor, I reject a little bit of the premise that you brought up that there's a hatred for the criminal, and I think Scott.
Well, that's what I get. That's what I get as a citizen. As a citizen, I want justice done. I want that person put away, not only for what they did, but so that they don't do it to me or my wife or you or your wife or children.
And I think that's where government and the criminal justice system come in, where they really have to be. And Scott, correct me if I'm wrong. Devoid of that emotion, and the focus, which is where you put it, has to be on how do we best protect citizens. The example I always use, Scott, and we'll talk about crime both, in the county and the city and the state and the nation, but the example that I use, I always bring it down to the most simple level, is that if I want to, on a nice summer night, grab my grandchildren and walk a mile or so to the snowball stand and get a soft ice cream or a snowball and walk back home, and it's dusk and it's sort of getting dark, I don't give it a second thought where I live.
The mosquitoes are the only thing you're worried about at that hour, right?
Yeah, right. I'm worried about that's about it. Or the mosquitoes going to bite. From my perspective, I think that's what everyone in America should be entitled to. And it would seem to me that that's what motivates your folks. Am I close to something there, or am I all wet on that?
I think you're absolutely right, dead on. When I was younger and in college, my parents' house, which is where I still lived, was broken into. Nobody was home. Everybody was at work. I was at school. They apparently injured the dog slightly, but I don't think my mother was ever the same because her house got violated. And everyone in this county not only has a right to walk with their grandchildren to get a snowball, but everyone has a right to be safe in their own home. And it comes back to the word that sometimes prosecutors, with regard to defendants, we have to be a little detached. We have to use objective standards. There's very often where, we'll be looking at pictures of things or reading really horrible descriptions. And, I used to not want to talk to other people outside about those things because it's so disturbing. But for some reason, our people have dedicated themselves to being able to go into court, convince a judge or a jury of what the facts are. But again, the motivation is the victim. And to make sure, we can't do anything to undo the last victim, but we can do something to stop the next victim.
Scott Shellenberger is our guest. I want to reset here along with Don Moeller, former Baltimore County executive. Scott Shellenberger, of course, local, Lock Raven, Loyola, UB, and a longtime Baltimore County state's attorney, and working in partnership with Don Moeller. So I'm bringing people together here, Don, is what we're doing, right?
Well, and Scott and I talked a lot, Nestor. Again, not only are we colleagues, we're friends, and as I said, I have full disclosure, great respect for the work that Scott does. And we didn't always agree on every issue, but we certainly were able to talk him through, and we agreed on the big picture. Scott, one of the things that comes up, and I'm not going to ask you to address the city situation, but I am going to ask you to address this philosophical issue. And that is, what should the relationship between a state's attorney's office be and the police department? Because that's an issue that gets written about, discussed. It's in criminal justice classes. From your perspective, how does your office work with police departments to make sure that you're not only getting good testimony and credible testimony, but also at the same time making sure that citizens get a fair shake when they think something's going amiss? How do you focus on that?
Well, it's really about communication. It's about communication at my level, which is typically between, the police chief and the command staff. But it's also about communication on a different level, and that is, I always make the statement: sergeants rule the world. Because everybody's just another kind of sergeant. It's just you got more stripes. So my folks work very closely with the heads of different agencies and departments within the police department, whether it's child abuse, sex offense, drug unit. You have to have communication. And look, the problem is we don't agree all the time. There's a different standard for why you arrest somebody. That's called probable cause. And then there's a higher standard for trying to get a conviction. That's convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are very different things. And so while we don't always agree, we do always try to have an intelligent, reasonable conversation about why a case can go forward or why a case cannot go forward. And unfortunately, a lot of times we do have to look at a police officer and say, no, that can't go forward. The other reason that there's some tension sometimes is because there are times when a police officer does something that's not right. And unfortunately, my office has to make a decision about whether they get prosecuted or, more importantly, whether their case gets referred to internal affairs. So you're always going to have that tension, even when you have a great relationship with a police department like I think we do. But there's always going to be some tension.
Well, Scott, talking of that tension, again, I reflect on the number of issues that we dealt with, and I don't think, and Nestor, you and I really have never talked about this at length. I think the area that I'm the most proud of, and you were key to this, was the way Baltimore County evolved and addressed the entire issue of how it dealt with sexual assaults. And you were a leader in Annapolis banging on the state to change the standard, to make it easier to prosecute sexual assaults. Maybe walk our listeners through how that issue has evolved in Baltimore County, because I think it's an area that people really care about. And the county really did evolve under your leadership.
Well, I really tried most of my big cases in the early 90s, and I was head of the sexual assault unit. And we've evolved so far since then. I mean, there was a time where, you would really be hard-pressed to pass a child abuse case or win a child abuse case. And some of the things that we've done in Annapolis over the years is to allow children to be recorded and testify, out of the presence of the defendant. That doesn't happen often. It's a hard standard to meet, but it's on the books. We've expanded the sexual assault laws over the years. There was a time where, it wasn't a crime to rape a woman who was unconscious. But we've evolved those laws to a great extent over the last several years. Now, candidly, Baltimore County did come under some criticism a few years ago about the way some of our sexual assault cases got handled.
And Scott, I felt strong when I interrupted you for a second. I want you to continue, but I want to be full disclosure that certainly our good friend Kevin Kamenetz and myself both thought that criticism was in some cases warranted, and that we did need to change the way that we handled those cases.
I absolutely agree, and not only change the way that we handled those cases in the police department, but then change the way in which we made communication about our decision making known to the victims and the advocates.
Well, give me a before and after. What was happening that is now changed?
That's a great question.
So there were certain sexual assaults which would be investigated by a patrol officer. So typically when you dial 911, you're going to get a patrol officer in a uniform and a patrol car. But we have a sexual offense unit in the police department, and unless the crime was a certain level of assault, sexual assault, then the sexual assault unit wouldn't go out. And when we saw that criticism, we felt like it was warranted, and so we made some adjustments to the sexual assault unit so that you're always getting a detective that's specially trained in that area, knows how to communicate with victims in that area, and make sure that the detective goes out and it's not just left to patrol. Years ago, GBMC started a program under Dr. Breitnecker where all sexual assault victims would go to GBMC and get a special kind of exam. Well, those exams are now called faith exams, and they've been standardized all over the state. And we have a great partnership with GBMC, and we've made sure that relationship keeps going. So there were some criticisms, including in my office, where we were sometimes making decisions about whether to charge a case or not charge a case based on a phone interview with a detective. We now do those interviews and reviews in person. And
talk also about, because it was such a major issue, Nestor, it gets to your point, about how we needed to change state law regarding the definition of the victim resisting or not resisting. I mean, that was such a key component, if you can educate us about that.
Sure. So in Maryland, juries were told for years that rape was force or threat of force against the will and without the consent, but they were also being told that the victim had to resist to the ability that they had and basically fight back. So I went down to the legislature and asked them and posed this question: tell me another crime that is on the books in the state of Maryland where we tell a victim that they have to fight and resist in order to prove their crime. You know, when a robber comes into your house and points a gun in your face, we didn't tell jurors that you're supposed to push the gun away. But that's what we were telling jurors in sexual assault cases. And a couple of years ago, we went down to Annapolis and explained that. And once we read the jury instruction and once we talked about that, the legislature moved very quickly. Our friend Bobby Zirkin, who was head of judiciary at that time, moved very quickly and took that element out. And now it's all about the force that's put on, and the victim is not forced to resist.
Well, Scott, I also think about this from years ago, and I don't know when this changed, but if a woman is raped, she'd wind up at the police station instead of the hospital, right? I mean, that was protocol in this country for forever until it changed recently. That unto itself, just where we were, sort of caveman-y. And again, we're three men here talking about, what has traditionally been something that women have had to deal with, and the men were making the rules for years and years, right? When did that change? And I know of the GBMC, but I am ignorant to this issue.
Well, that did change quite a while ago. GBMC, has been doing this work since really the 80s and early 90s. But
Wow.
I think the thing that really pushed it was the advent of DNA. DNA started where we were able to collect samples and identify individuals. And so it was really the advent of DNA that police departments and state's attorneys' offices realized that it was more important to get the victim for a sexual assault exam so you could collect evidence than it was to necessarily get a statement while you're in a police precinct. And so that began to evolve, but it's gotten even better because for years it was a very sterile culture where, it was basically the ability to collect evidence. Now when a victim goes to GBMC, not only do they collect evidence, but there are victim advocates there. There are safe nurses who are specifically trained into how to deal with victims, and there's a more holistic approach to dealing with the sexual assault victim and follow-up the next day or a couple days later that deal more with trying to heal the victim than just collecting evidence.
Scott Shellenberger is our guest. He is the state's attorney for Baltimore County, and of course the Baltimore County Executive Don Moeller joining us here on Baltimore Positive. And so many of these issues are county, city, as we have talked about it, Don. For the city and the county. And I read the Baltimore Magazine piece. We're going to have Ron Cassie on about merging the two communities in some way, and obviously crime doesn't stop either way. Across that border. And Scott, I grew up over at East Point Mall area, Baltimore County. I mean, we were always a half a mile from the city, right? And the city-county thing that we have dealt with all of our lives here. Surveillance would be one of these things that I talked to Brian Frosch about a little bit, and I live at the harbor, and I'm always thinking, how can we make the city safer? And you're thinking, how can we keep the county safer? The surveillance part of this and doorbells and evidence and where you gather evidence that now is sort of all around us with video cameras and cell phones and schools and whatnot. Where are you with surveillance and evidence as it comes in regard to what is, I think, at the heart of what you do, putting the bad guys away? If I have more evidence, other than every night when the president gets up and gives us evidence at 6 o'clock, your evidence you actually use to prosecute people, how can these planes or how can other things and technologies, and I know you were very adoptive of early technologies as well in the county, how can these help us as citizens to keep us safer?
So back in, I hate to do these dates, but 1988, I tried my first robbery case. And it was a guy comes into a 7-Eleven, holds a gun to the clerk's head, steals money, and leaves. And my case was solely the clerk walking in and say, that guy done it. We couldn't win that case nowadays because jurors expect to see surveillance video. They expect to see cell phone information about where the person's location was. They expect to see the Ring doorbell cameras. They expect to see and hear about DNA. Nowadays, we try our cases so much differently than I did back in the day, and jurors expect it. They expect it partly because of TV and movies, but they also expect it because they know that the technology is out there. So nowadays, when my folks go downstairs, they're usually dragging large TVs, tons of computers. There's usually some very good video somewhere in the case about what happened. It is remarkable. We record felony interviews of defendants. Back in the day, an officer would come in and say, I read him his Miranda rights, and he confessed. And that would be the testimony. Now, you hit play. You see the rights being read and shown to him in writing. You see the defendant sign the form. You hear him say what he did or didn't do. And jurors expect that, and we give it to them. And that's why we constantly are searching out the technology.
Well, speaking of that, Scott, you were there on the ground floor. We were there together. We were rolling our sleeves up with former county executive Kevin Kamenetz. Wish he was still around to have these discussions. But we were in that room with Police Chief, you, me, Kevin Kamenetz, and we were trying to figure out body cameras. We are several years in now. Baltimore County was one of the first to go full bore into the program. Give us an update. How's it working? What have the growing pains been, and what's the future of it?
Sure. So I have to make sure everybody knows I did not want to do body cameras because
I wasn't going to say that, Scott.
I like to tell the truth.
Well, that's good. We like the truth around here.
I like to tell the truth. So I had some arguments with, God rest his soul, Kevin Kamenetz.
What was your argument, by the way? Why did you not want them?
It's very labor intensive for my office. So when a police officer walks up to a victim and has his body camera on, the first thing he asks or she asks is, ma'am, what's your name, address, phone number, and cell phone? And that gets recorded. Well, I have to turn that video over to the bad guy. And so I needed people who were going to shield that, or sometimes we use the word redact, but we try to use the word shield, because I needed to protect that victim and witness personal information. And I was worried that I wasn't going to get the resources to be able to do that. I now have 15 people whose full-time jobs is to watch body camera videos and shield personal information. It's very labor intensive. Right now they're all working from home with their laptops, but I was worried I wouldn't get the resources. I have admitted that I was wrong. Body cameras was the best thing that we've ever done in Baltimore County. It is absolutely a game changer. I think everyone changes their behavior, and now there's no question about what happened. You just hit play. And so we see them being used a lot in domestic violence cases, because very often on a Friday night at 11 at night when 911 is called and the police officer shows up at the door and the victim is crying and says, he hit me, and you can see the bruise, on Tuesday that victim's usually calling my office saying, oh, I fell down the steps. Well, now I have the perfect evidence of what really happened, whether the victim wants to go forward or not. And so the body cameras have just been a complete game changer, and I have candidly admitted places that I was wrong, that this was one of the best things we ever did. And Kevin and I had a few discussions about this, and
I remember them quite well.
And I candidly say Kevin was right. This was the best thing we've ever done.
Well, you know, Scott, and I know we're coming up against the clock. I appreciate your time. We are going to have you back. I've got a couple more questions there, Nestor, before we do that. But, Nestor, the point I want to make is I want the folks who are listening to rewind and listen to what the Baltimore County State's Attorney just said again, when he said he now has 15 people dedicated to reviewing body camera footage. When folks talk about public safety and governance, it's not free. Those 15 people cost, right, Scott? They're expanding your budget that you needed to fight for.
But that's not a cost if we're putting the bad guys away the right way, right?
Well, that's what you need to make people understand.
It's a benefit.
Scott, I'm correct, right? Your budget had to expand to support this.
That's exactly right. I mean, 15 people, they're all paralegals. They either have a 2-year paralegal degree or a 4-year college degree. Got a lot of young people down there who it's their first, big job out of college, and they work very hard and they crank it out. And the main motivation is protecting the victim's personal information.
Right. Now, the other thing, Nestor, in full disclosure, and we talk about public safety in Baltimore County, Scott, you mentioned, again, she grew up in Catonsville, so I've known her since I was a little kid. But former state's attorney, Sandy O'Connor. Sandy was state's attorney for how many years?
I believe it was 36.
30? Think about that, Nestor. Sandra O'Connor was state's attorney for 36 years.
Might have been 32. It's either 32 or 36, yeah.
36 years. Scott Shellenberger has been state's attorney now for 14 years. It will be 16, I guess, at the next election.
Are you worn out yet, or are you all right?
For 50-some years, Baltimore County, when you talk about public safety, has had two state's attorney. That stability matters. And where I'm going with that is both my good friend Sandy O'Connor and my good friend Scott Shellenberger and I have a basic philosophical difference. And I want Scott to have the opportunity to talk about why he's right and I'm wrong. And that
I do that all the time, Scott. Get used to it.
That has to do with the death penalty. Both Sandy and Scott know that I'm opposed to the death penalty. Nestor, I think you're supportive of it, so you're probably going to appreciate Scott's approach. I'm not supportive of it. And, Scott, you've been an advocate, much to the chagrin of many of my progressive friends out there who just think you're way too hard-nosed on the death penalty. Why are you and Sandy O'Connor right and I'm wrong?
Well, number one, I think your listeners know that Maryland did get rid of the death penalty. I was down fighting for it for many years. There are a few people who think I was the only one that kept it around for a couple of years, but eventually Governor O'Malley and the legislature decided that it should go away.
And by the way, we had a spirited debate with him about that a month ago, too. So.
I'm sure you did. I had many spirited debates with the governor about that. I was in favor of the death penalty, number one, because there are some defendants who I always called the worst of the worst, who, just pose such a public safety risk and deserve the ultimate punishment for the ultimate crime they committed. One of the biggest cases that I ever tried with Ann Brobst, who unfortunately passed away also, was the Stephen Oken case. He committed two horrendous murders in Baltimore County, and then went up to Maine and committed another murder. He was an individual that did not deserve to even have life in prison. Wesley Baker, who Sandy O'Connor prosecuted, killed a grandmother over on the west side. So, there are just some defendants who I believe were the worst of the worst and should not have been allowed to continue. I lost that argument. Maryland at the time now has life and life without parole. So far, life without parole has meant life without parole. So far, life has meant a lot of people spending a very long period of time in jail. But I felt it was partly a deterrent and partly the appropriate punishment for the crime that was committed. And those were my arguments for many years, and ultimately I lost that political argument.
Have you changed your mind or no?
Oh, no.
Okay.
And
I don't think I have either, right? Like we don't talk a lot about it, but I'm on any given day I'm more pro death penalty than not, and it's hard to vacillate on that. But I don't. If someone did that to my wife, my child, your wife, your child, your grandchild, I would have a bloodlust that would make me pro death penalty, and I'm not ashamed of that.
Before we move on, I would argue that that's the role of the state to not have the bloodlust. And to back away and think of things like life without parole. But that's what makes the world go round. Scott, before we let you go, what does pandemic do to a crime and why to crime rates and crime in communities, and why does it do what it does? Give us an update on that before we let you get out of here.
Nobody's leaving the house.
Interestingly enough, crime is down in the county. And partly it's because, there's less opportunity. When you go to work and there's nobody in a house, it's pretty easy to break into a house. And that is a burglary or a breaking and entering. When you go in a house and people are in there and you steal from them, that's a robbery. And that's a whole different level of crime, one that some criminals have decided to draw the line at. So it does seem like our crime has been down. As of right about now, we've had 11 homicides in Baltimore County this year. Last year, unfortunately, we had one of the worst years ever. We had 51, which we had never...
I thought that was Scott, we'll never know until we look 5, 6, 7 years out. My gut told me, looking at all the data, and I track that stuff daily, for 20 years. I mean, literally daily I tracked it in my office on a spreadsheet. I thought last year, for some reason, was an outlier. What was your sense of last year?
I absolutely agree. I mean, in 2014, there were 25, 2015,
Right.
25, 33, 35, and then all of a sudden it jumped to 51. Yeah. I really do believe it was a complete outlier. And, some of these cases we're just starting to dig into now because there's always a lag from the time an arrest is made until we're getting ready for trial. But I do think last year was an outlier. But I can also tell you that crime is down in the county right now. So we have to make a decision about, do we want to lock everybody down all the time or not?
Well, Scott, one of the things that Nestor is so impressed by, he's commented it on with different guests, is, and you play a key role in this in your office, maybe talk about why it is real quick, is the clearance rates in Baltimore County for crimes, but particularly for homicide. I mean, our clearance rates are off the charts, higher than state.
Well, I'm astonished how many people can get away with murder in our culture, especially when there's a camera in every corner. That's the part that shocks me.
And that doesn't happen in Baltimore County. Why is that, Scott?
Well, we do have a clearance rate that averages in the 80s. 1 year they did have a clearance rate of 90-something, which was one of the highest that's ever happened. A lot of it is that our witnesses are cooperative. I think a lot of it is we have a really, really good homicide unit in the county. They always put some of the best detectives in there who are really dedicated and will work a case. So it's a combination of that, the detectives, the fact that they work so hard, the fact that we do have more cooperative witnesses, and the fact that there's so much technology out here in the county that often will capture some portion of the case or a defendant that at least gives us leads as to where we need to go.
Hey, it's been a great visit with you. I hope we can actually do it from within 5.5 feet at some point here because we are all so local, and hope you're sequestered. What's life like for you? You've been working from home like everyone else? I mean, it's been a difficult transition for everyone, but certainly the folks in government, it's been more work for most of you, right?
Come on, ask Don if he thinks I'm working from home. I'm sitting in my office right now with a...
I saw that 887 number. I thought, that son of a gun is in his office.
Well, but candidly, so we have been bringing 2 attorneys in, sometimes 3 a day to handle bail reviews. All my other people are working from home. I got at least 130 laptops at home cranking out the work. Unfortunately, one of the oldest guys in the office and his deputy, who are both over the age of 60, are a little addicted to work. And so I've been here every day, and I'll send you a picture, but I have a shirt and tie on right now because this is all I've ever wanted to do. This is what I love, and believe it or not, there's plenty for me to do. I spend a lot of my time now carrying boxes of mail and putting them into trunks of my support staff, who then take it home and scan it and put it in our electronic system so that the attorneys can keep working. So one of my most important jobs right now is to say, hey, pop your trunk.
Well, hey,
Scott, we're not going to let you get out of here. We ask, and I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Aspirations for higher office. I mean, you've been a successful elected official. Nobody even runs against you. You can be state's attorney to your 110 if you want.
That sounds about right.
Scott Shellenberger want to run for other elective office down the road?
Nope. This is the only elected job I ever wanted. When I was young, 20s, I said, this is the one I want to do. I followed my dream. I got lucky, and I got the job that I've always wanted, and I would stay till I am 110 if I can. I love this job.
For Sandy O'Connor's record. Is that what
I would like to break it, but it's going to be a little tough.
I wanted to be elected Orioles owner, but we'll save that for the second conversation, Scott.
Okay.
Hey, man, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the biography and the background and all the work you're doing out on the front lines to make sure that all the citizens are safe. And I'm in the city, and you're in the county, and my business is in the county. And, obviously you've been doing it a long, long time. And I like to know that there's somebody out there making the bad guys pay for the bad guy stuff they do. And we do appreciate that.
Thank you all for having me on.
You got it. Scott Shellenberger joining us here. State's Attorney General for Baltimore County, and Attorney General for Baltimore County. I got to get all my titles right. Former Baltimore County Executive Don Mueller, but I have to call him County Executive, even though it's former. I'm a former sports talk show host now doing Baltimore Positive. You can find all of our work, and we're doing so much stuff with the arts. We're doing so much stuff next week with universities and having university folks on, and really looking forward to having Freeman Rabowski back on from UMBC. So much so that I've kept my UMBC hat on up on the front of my Facebook. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We're on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. We've merged our WNST.net sports programming with our Baltimore Positive programming. We're keeping calm, we're staying local, and we're talking to a lot of smart people around here. Big thanks to Scott Shellenberger. Back for more. We are Baltimore Positive.